Okay, I think everybody is admitted now. We can start the last panel. It gives me great pleasure to welcome everyone to the last panel of our conference towards a brave new world, rebuilding Europe after Napoleon. For those who don't know me, my name is Ozan Özavcı. I'm an assistant professor of history at Utrecht University. I work on Euro-Middle East and trans-imperial histories of diplomacy and security from the late 18th century to the early 20th centuries. I'm also one of the conveners of the Security History Network. Our panel this evening in the Netherlands consists of 3 papers on 3 different but somewhat linked subjects. So I'm going to leave it to our audience to find the links between the papers. Each presentation will last up to 20 minutes. I will introduce our speakers before their talk, and after the 3rd presentation, I will read your questions and comments, which you can submit to Alexander Mikaberidze via direct chat. Alex will gather the questions together and share them with me. And as I said, I will read them out for our speakers. So without further ado, please allow me to introduce our first speaker, Silvio Berardi, who is based at Niccolò Cusano University of Rome. Silvio's research interests focus primarily on the history of the Italian Republican Party and the reconstruction of the process of European integration in the 19th and 20th centuries. He's particularly interested in focusing on the continental federalist proposals that were aimed at the creation of a united Europe. He has also worked on the decolonization of Africa and Italian alternatives offered mainly by the Italian Republican movement, with a view on creating a Euro-African cooperation. So Silvia's paper is titled The European Project of Louis-Philippe, Duke of Orleans. Silvia, if you're ready, the floor is yours.
Good evening everybody, and thank you for this welcome invitation. I will share my screen, but I'm sorry, but my webcam doesn't work today, and I don't know why, but I can share my screen with my presentation.
Yes, but
okay. Good evening again, everybody, and good afternoon for the American audience, and thank you for this welcome invitation. I will try to outline some guidelines of the pro-European projection of Louis-Philippe d'Orléans, which I believe sanctioned a first important break with respect to the European project that arose from the Vienna Congress. The work of Louis-Philippe allowed him to govern in France for 18 years through a balanced formula based on 2 main guidelines: the defense of the interest of the moderate clergy and the enlightened aristocracy. And at the same time, he recovered the founding values of the French Girondin tradition. With Louis-Philippe, son of Philippe Égalité, France tried to revive those liberal ideals completely eliminated by Charles X. From the beginning, the new king had to struggle amidst the difficulties of a misunderstanding on the origins of the new monarchy, which, while for many it presented itself as the product of a victorious revolution and therefore destined to develop further revolutionary action at home and abroad, for others it represented instead the solution adopted to stem and prevent a revolutionary spread. So this is the soul of the new monarchy, the 2 souls of the new monarchy. Louis-Philippe had approved a constitution whose mechanisms, although they did not differ much from the previous one granted by Louis XVIII in 1814, those mechanisms had completely changed in its ideological presuppositions. First of all, it was a constitution approved by the parliament, and not obtained and not octroyé or granted by the king, who was king of the French with the revolutionary formula by the grace of God and the will of the nation. This was a major constitutional innovation that linked sovereignty to the bourgeoisie, and not only to the monarch, who, according to an expression by Adolphe Thiers, règne mais ne gouverne pas. Sorry, but it's so to reconcile the principle of dynastic legitimacy with the principle of national sovereignty. This is a point. Another strong symbol of the new monarchy was the adoption of the tricolor flag to replace the white flag with the golden lilies of the Bourbons. The census for being electors or deputies was lowered by the new constitution, and the multiple votes introduced in 1820 were abolished. The legislative initiative also became parliamentary, as well as royal, obviously. However, the rise to power in favor of a bourgeois uprising earned Louis-Philippe the hostility of numerous European courts and the nickname of the King of the Barricades. And again, these two souls of the new monarchy. The first 10 years of his reign were characterized by political dynamism, with as many as 15 governments that took turns. If the executive, headed by Jacques Lafitte, still had reformist aspirations, the successive governments, starting from the government of Casimir Perier, fully expressed the moderate turning point and tied themselves, above all, to values and interests of the upper middle class. The moderate character of Louis-Philippe monarchy was confirmed in foreign policy, also by the prevalence of an orientation contrary to any adventure in the international field, and much less inclined to support the Italian and Polish uprisings that broke out in that period. Then, starting in 1840 with the advent of François Guizot, French politics underwent a further conservative turn that increasingly favored the needs of the French upper class. In the international field, the principle of non-intervention, that is a central point of the foreign policy of Louis-Philippe, is a principle proclaimed by Louis-Philippe immediately after the Revolution of July 1830 in France, and established in opposition to the concept of intervention proclaimed by the Holy Alliance. Obviously, every state must refrain from any interference in the internal affairs of another state. General Lafayette, in the session of the Chamber of Deputies on January 1831, clarified this concept. I'm sure, he said, that no minister will deny today the definition I gave of our system of non-intervention, when I said every time that a people or a country of Europe will claim its rights and want to exercise its sovereignty, whatever intervention by foreign governments to oppose it will amount to a direct and formal declaration of war on France, not only because of our duties to the cause of humanity, but because it is a direct attack on the principle of our existence. This is a translation obviously provided by me from the French. So, in the session of the Chamber of March 1831, therefore 2 months after the declaration of General Lafayette, the Prime Minister, Casimir Perier, gave to the principle of non-intervention in some respect a different interpretation, in some way more selfish. We adopt, he said, the principle of non-intervention. We recognize that the foreign policy does not have the right to intervene with his own hands in the internal affairs of another people, but we do not undertake to carry arms wherever this principle is not respected. Is more selfish in these words. This interpretation was accepted and confirmed by his colleague, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Horace Francois Bastien-Sébastiani, always at the same meeting. Undoubtedly, what France most desired at that moment was expressed in clear form by General Sébastiani in the Chamber of Deputies during the session of December 6, 1830. The government, he said, desires peace. He will do everything compatible with the honor and the interest of France to maintain it. The principle of non-intervention is at the same time a guarantee for the peoples, for governments, and for all social order. Thus, at the declaration of independence of Belgium, proclaimed by the revolutionary government, Louis-Philippe solemnly formulated the will to defend the people who rose up for the protection of the freedom and independence of their homeland. In fact, France defended this principle for the separation of Belgium from the Kingdom of the Netherlands. When on August 25, 1830, the insurrection broke out in Brussels, an insurrection that quickly spread throughout Belgium, the Dutch government, unable to put down the revolt, asked for an help, but neither France nor Great Britain came to his aid, and instead they obtained a discussion on the matter at an international conference held in London between December 1830 and January 1831. So the King of the French made it known to the European powers, and above all to Prussia and Russia, that France will not intervene in Belgium and that it will not tolerate the intervention of another power. Count Louis-Mathieu Molé had the task of reporting this decision to the Prussian ambassador Werther, while the sovereign itself affirmed this provision to the Russian ambassador Pozzo di Borgo. And when at the end of December 1830, the Belgians, now independent from the Netherlands, began looking for a sovereign, Louis-Philippe still affirmed that it is believed that the Belgians would be willing to ask for one on my son, said Louis-Philippe. But this idea must be discarded, and it should not even be discussed, as in the current state of Europe, such a discussion would be dangerous and would have no chance of success. Undoubtedly, this sentence of the French king did not fully correspond to what had been his true intentions regarding the new sovereign of Belgium. In his heart, he hoped that his son, the Duke of Nemours, would have been able to achieve the crown, obviously. The drastic stance of Henry John Temple Palmerston, Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, made that desire totally unrealizable. And the French ambassador to London himself, Talleyrand Périgord, the well-known Talleyrand Périgord, understood the need to avoid any conflict with Great Britain. However, still in May 1834, Louis-Philippe wrote to the new sovereign of Belgium, Leopold I. Nobody ignores that what we want is the real and not nominal independence of Belgium, is Louis-Philippe to Leopold I. We want Belgium to be independent, and we established that it was perpetually neutral so that it could not get involved in such ties. The independence of Belgium is also important to us under another aspect, which you know well, and that is the basis, the link of our alliance with England, which is so precious to us and which is the guarantee of peace and social order, is a clear line in foreign policy. On the same wavelength, the letter written by Prince Talleyrand Périgord to the French foreign minister at the time, Charles-Joseph Bresson, in November 1834. In these 4 years, wrote Talleyrand Périgord, the general peace maintained allowed all our relations to become simpler. The cooperation we have obtained from England has cost neither our independence nor our national sensitivities. And such was our respect for the rights of the others, such was the openness of our procedures, which, far from inspiring mistrust, is our guarantee that is being claimed today against certain indications that worry the old Europe. So there is a kind of entente cordiale, and therefore arising between Paris and London, which, with some interruptions, had to last until 1848, and which during the negotiations of 1830-1831 consolidated itself considerably, even if at the same time its limits were manifested, above all, in the continuous warnings of Palmerston from Paris. Still on the foreign policy front, the colonial enterprise in North Africa must be remembered. The French conquest of Algeria from 1830 to 1847, the conquest with which Louis-Philippe wanted to strengthen French control over the Mediterranean, was perhaps the event that most weakened relations between France and Great Britain. Already in 1827, a clash had arisen between Hussein Dey, the regent of Algiers, and the local French consul, which soon resulted in a naval blockade against French, which in turn invaded and conquered Algiers in 1830, quickly taking over the control of the remaining coastal communities. The successes achieved pushed Paris to undertake a real military campaign against Algeria, a campaign that crushed all kinds of internal resistance in the country. Despite many uncertainties and ambiguities, Louis-Philippe was therefore able to reign and govern, and at the same time gave vent to his tendency, which often took naive forms of vanity, to appear the inspirer and supreme moderator of a policy aimed at ensuring prosperity and the well-being of the French through peace abroad and a regime of order and authority within. His motto was "Enrichissez-vous." However, as Raymond Guyot well observed, the fundamental weakness of the Anglo-French Entente was the lack of a true commonality of economic interests between the two nations. French industrialists complained about the threat of English competition and demanded custom tariffs that were met with indignant astonishment in Britain. French and British commercial interests then clashed in Greece and Spain, as well as in Africa and in the Pacific. In 1837, Palmerston complained that the dominant motive of French foreign policy was the jealousy of English economic prosperity and the desire to stop its development. The foreign policy of French under the monarchy of July was therefore characterized by two fundamental elements: a new system of alliances marked by the rapprochement with the United Kingdom, with the cordial agreement and the conquest of Algeria, and the framework of a policy that aimed above all to keep France at peace with its European neighbors. That's a foreign policy summarized in Perrier's work: peace without honor costs nothing. The already mentioned and not easy rapprochement between Paris and London was confirmed in a huge number of letters written by Louis-Philippe to his ministers and advisors. Among these, without any doubt, stood out the elderly Prince of Talleyrand Perigord, the French ambassador to the United Kingdom from September 1830 to November 1834, for whom the French sovereign always showed that he had a very particular esteem, and to whom he recognized always having been the main architect of the Entente Cordiale. In a letter dated November 1834, this is how he expressed himself towards him. I wish, my dear Prince, that you return to Paris as soon as possible. I am sure that only you can guarantee and consolidate this great work of unity in the two countries and the maintenance of the peace and security of Europe that you have carried out so far with so much success. The awareness of this important milestone was also expressed by Talleyrand Perigord himself to the Duke of Wellington, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. In fact, it was how the Prince expressed himself. Dear Duke, it is to all of Europe, to the honest and enlightened men of all countries, that I address my joyful compliment today. Power has returned to the only hands prudent and firm enough to know how to keep it and use it only in the interest of peace, good order, and wise freedom. From the beginning of 1832, in fact, a fairly evident contrast emerged in Europe, which lasted until the end of the 30s. France and Great Britain would often find themselves united in contrasting Russia, Austria, and Prussia. In the years immediately following the Ottoman crisis of 1839-40, however, the Franco-British agreement, as already mentioned, would have weakened, and a new process of realignment would have started in the European system, which would have seen Paris get closer to the position of the absolute monarchies. So there is a change in the foreign policy. In previous years, however, France decided, following the riots of 1831, to adopt a competitive international policy with respect to Austria, Prussia, and Russia, which turned out to be convergent with that of Great Britain, and which found its formal consecration in the Quadruple Iberian Alliance of April 22, 1834, signed by Talleyrand and Louis-Philippe, in order to restore peace in the Iberian Peninsula. In conclusion, Louis-Philippe distanced itself significantly from the previous Bourbon regimes, making a sincere break with the order established at the Congress of Vienna, becoming, at least initially, more distant from Austria, Prussia, and Russia, and close to the Great Britain, at least until 1839, when the conservative characteristics of the regime were accentuated again, and Guizot, appointed foreign minister in 1840, after having been ambassador to London for a few months, again shifted the axis of foreign policy towards the first three powers. When the underappreciated request for renewal coming from French society, in a very similar way to what happened during the reign of Charles X, provoked the epilogue of the long reign of Louis-Philippe d'Orléans. Thanks for your kind attention.
Thank you, Silvio, for this really interesting presentation. I really enjoyed listening to it. The points you make link quite nicely with the presentation of our third speaker, Eric de Lange. But before that, and before we move on to the next presentation by Joep Schenk, I'd like to make an announcement about how to submit your questions. I've just found out that Alex had to attend another event to give a key talk there. So if you have any questions and comments, please send them to me, not to Alex, via direct chat. So our second speaker, I think we can move on to the presentation by Joep Schenk, my colleague from Utrecht University, with whom I've also shared an office for the last 8 years or so. Joep is an assistant professor in the History of International Relations section. His expertise is in global economic and international political history, which allows him to examine current IR developments within a broader historical framework. Recently, he published an excellent monograph on the Rhine River Commission and the making of a security culture in Europe in the 19th century. And currently, Joep is researching international environmental cooperation and competition in historical perspective. Joep's talk is titled Purchasing Liberty with Transimperial Rivalry. Joep, if you're ready, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ozan. Thank you, everybody, for giving me the opportunity to present some early research on the Berlin West Africa Conference that I am carrying out right now. So the Act of Navigation for the Congo, issued at this Berlin West Africa Conference in 1885, went much further in the application of the principle of freedom of navigation than any other act of international river navigation before. And this paper hopefully clarifies how the act was celebrated as the ultimate implementation of the 1815 principles, of the 1815 Vienna principles, but in reality stretched the concept of liberty and freedom to an extent that benefited merely the great colonial powers and went at the expense of another principle, namely the concept of neutrality. And I hope that point will become clear at the end of this paper. Generally, the 1884-1885 Berlin West Africa Conference is understood as a diplomatic attempt to resolve the rising tensions among the European powers by creating a legal and political framework that ensured an orderly colonial expansion. Because this is such a clear example of inter-imperial cooperation, it's also surprising that historians in the emerging field of inter- and trans-imperial history have not set as much foot in the archives of the German Imperial Colonial Office as might be thought, because that archive holds the files and minutes of this conference. In this paper, I will ask how a neutral Congo basin was understood as a possible solution to inter-imperial rivalry in Africa. And I hope to demonstrate how an intersubjective process of contesting conceptions of security and neutrality indeed steered the legal experts to a rather political position towards the Berlin debates. In the following, I will briefly introduce the historical context of the escalating conflict between Portugal and Great Britain about the Congo River that led to this conference, after which I will zoom into the efforts of a community of international lawyers, legal experts, that launched the principle of neutrality with the aim of taking out the sting of the conflict and create a precedent also for future conflict resolutions on the African continent. And finally, I argue that this effort was at least partially successful, as it resulted in serious participation of legal experts during this Berlin West Africa Conference, and also set the conceptual bandwidth for the diplomatic talks to an extent. So I do want to pay tribute in this paper to, of course, Beatrice de Graaf and Ozan Ozachi when it comes to security culture, and inter-imperial history, but also to Koskaniemi and Engi and van der Smissen, who wrote extensively on the expansion of international legal standards at the end of the 19th century. Furthermore, Haas is important in understanding the role of an epistemic society, an international epistemic community, and of course, Constantine Ardeleanu and Joao are important for me because they wrote extensively on other river regimes, including the Danube, the Rhine, but also the Congo. So, the escalating conflict at the Congo. I would say unknown is unloved, but when it comes to the Congo, also the opposite applies. And in the end of the 1870s, the Western world got exposed to the results of the explorations of Livingstone and de Brazza and Stanley. And Stanley, although American, was a proxy of the Belgian king, as Leopold's Association Internationale du Congo, that was aiming for being charged with sovereign powers over the Congo basin. And the wide distribution of the publications of these explorers confirmed the existence of infinite fertile riparian lands and millions of inhabitants in the very center of the African continent. And importantly, Stanley's reports corroborated the navigability of the part of the river stream beyond the famous Yellow Falls that you can also see on this picture on the right. This made these territories very interesting for imperial minds. And after all, the infrastructure was already there, the river. And these surprising and promising settings at the Upper Congo made the Congo estuary at the African west coast instantly loved and thus also vulnerable for age-old territorial claims by European powers. Indeed, soon Portugal worried about the French explorer Brazza, who started signing treaties with local chiefs, ceding strips of land on the Congo to France. By 1882, France's main colonial competitor Britain endorsed these worries, and it seriously considered to recognize Portuguese sovereignty in part of the Congo estuary as a means to halt further French expansion in the region. Of course, Britain's recognition of Portuguese sovereignty would not go unpaid. Portugal would allow for free navigation on the Congo and the Zambezi River. The Dutch, on their part, had more commercial posts than any other nation in the Lower Congo, an area that was not governed by any European regime yet. And they, therefore, were anxious to retain the commercial liberties and protested strongly against a British-Portuguese treaty. The Netherlands was supported in its protest by Spain, the United States, and even by parts of the British general public, who did not trust the Portuguese to be the guarantors of free trade. And they were also sensitive for anti-slavery arguments that had been circulating to discredit Portugal. After 1877, the prospect that European powers would start a conflict over the control of a wealthy African river was seriously enough for many commentators to publish on the matter. And the Belgian political economist and legal expert, Émile de Lavallée, wrote in December 1882, "If explorers of other nations imitate the example of Mr. de Brazza, we will soon on the banks of the Congo have English, German, Portuguese, Italian, and Dutch territories with their own borders, forts, cannons, soldiers, rivalries, and perhaps one day their own hostilities. Is it not yet enough to see how the banks of our own rivers in Europe are everywhere on both sides littered with terrifying arms?" So this is how, in little time, the Congo and the Congo Basin became the central verbal battleground for conflicting European interests of commerce at the beginning of the 1880s. And under these escalating circumstances, the conceptual novelty of neutralism emerged from the midst of Europe's nascent legal intelligentsia in the early 1880s. The British-Portuguese Treaty was signed in February 1884, but due to enormous diplomatic and public pressure, indeed this treaty was never ratified. The Berlin West Africa Conference was asked to convene, took place between November 1884 and February 1885, and the representatives of 14 states were present, including the main imperial powers in the United States and the Ottoman Empire. And they deliberated on three urgent matters: establishing freedom of commerce in the Congo Basin and Congo estuary, implementing freedom of navigation on the Congo and the Niger rivers, and define the criteria for effective new occupations of the African coast. It convened 10 times as a conference. As a commission, it summoned 26 times in this period. And while the conference sessions were mainly a formality, the main work was being done in these commissions or in this commission. And early in the conference, it was decided that the commission could take advantage from tapping from all relevant sources of information as long as plenipotentiaries decided on all matters. Now, this opened up the way to involve all kinds of experts, such as legal experts, in the conference midst. And the importance of scientific, neutral, if you wish, and practical expertise was also amplified by the impressive collection of brochures, books, magazines, and maps that were being exhibited and also loaned in the conference room in the Reich Chancellery in the Wilhelmstrasse. In the following, I will zoom into the efforts of a community of international lawyers, and I will specifically showcase what they perceived as imminent threats and vital interests, and how international cooperation was the solution to these dangers. Once again, Émile de Lavelaye was an important figure here. He clearly depicted a threat, namely the military tensions of Europe that could also be exported to the African continent. So indeed, he was afraid of inter-imperial rivalries, mainly because of France's expansion. The interests at stake here, as he described it, were humanitarian, the benefit of all, and protect existing trading stations. And he had a specific method, or actually two suggestions to carry this out. First, an internationally financed railroad, he suggested, to complement the river, and second, the complete neutralization of the river, with an international commission securing the freedom of navigation. So neutralizing the river, but also neutralizing the entire territory, including the stations, the commercial or trading stations along the Congo, was one of his suggestions. With his article of December 1882, but especially his article La Neutralité du Congo of June 1883, de Lavelaye was one of the founders of the public debate on the Congo. And de Lavelaye was also one of the founding members of the Institut de Droit International. And it was this national institute that saw an opportunity to make itself and its promoted impartiality relevant to the world of international affairs by picking up on this matter of international importance. The institute was founded in 1873 by a group of experts on international law, wishing to ensure, and I quote, that those principles of justice and humanity which should govern the mutual relations of people shall prevail, end of quote. And in a memorandum of July 1883, one of the driving forces behind the institute, the Swiss Gustave Moignet, also one of the establishers of the Red Cross, concurred with Lavelaye's concerns. The danger was indeed twofold. And I quote, "The whites who encounter there do not all live in good harmony, and," he wrote, "it is all the more serious as there's no lack of inflammable elements." And I quote further, "We must not be so blind as to imagine that having been peaceful up to now, rivalries do not exist, and that the presence of soldiers under the orders of competitors does not constitute a real danger." So indeed, he saw a real danger there. Potential sources of conflict also made it that interest groups in Europe, such as the chambers of commerce and explorers, such as the German Gerhard Rolfs, started to worry about the integrity of the main transport routes for European commerce and exploration because of these quarrels. And those alarmed, Moignet observed, believed that these dangers could be averted by placing, and I quote again, "the actions of whites under the collective control of civilized powers," end of quote, by the express recognition of tutelary rules, of course, legal rules, international law. Moignet wasn't much charmed by the concept of neutralization, as it was coined by de Lavelaye. He noted that in the end, the goal was to safeguard the liberty to peacefully navigate the Congo and its tributaries for everybody, always. So monopolies should be abolished as, and I quote, "no obstacle should be placed in the way of the civilizing activity of any people in its navigable parts," end of quote. Moignet, like many others at the time, directly connected commerce, colonization, and the civilizing effort in the word progress. So how to protect such a regime? Moignet pointed at the Treaty of Paris that was established in 1856 by the European powers and opened the maritime Danube for international navigation. Something similar could be established on the Congo, he thought, and it would be hard at first, but, and I quote, "the Negroes would consent less readily as they were used to forbid the other tribes to trade on its own territory." But according to Moignet, this all did not really matter. In the end, it were, and I quote again, "the civilized races that should first establish an agreement, then they would agree to bring the natives in line. And I quote again, to fly there the flag of free trade, free travel, and free settlement on land as well as on water would of course be in the interest of the whole world. Monnier noted, and he did not see any national interest that would oppose it, neither the French or the Portuguese. A little goodwill, in fact, will be enough, he said, to make it a reality. So there remained one question to be answered. Monnier wrote between which states such an arrangement should be concluded. Was it like in Vienna in 1815 between those states through which the river flowed? No, that was quite clearly not the case. According to Monnier, it should be the European powers as the Congo flows, and I quote again, almost entirely through savage country and those who do not involve in international organizations. That is why it was better to look at the Danube once again, where it were non-riparian states that concluded the agreement in 1856. So there was an example already. One other task that Monnier saw for the International Commission was to prevent the native chiefs from putting obstacles in the way of the principle of freedom of navigation. This could be achieved, he argued, little by gentleness. That was by persuasion and example. He wouldn't go as far as to argue to disarm the colonizers, but he predicted no drop of blood would be spilled in the name of civilization. And the International Commission of the Congo would, in his eyes, have all the more prestige in the eyes of the Negroes, as it would speak to them in the name of all whites united in a common thought. If the Commission would be provided with enough powers, it would be the better way to protect against piracy, against violent attacks or other crimes, than if one state alone would take upon itself this task, as states would demand, such kind of lonely states would demand for compensation, such as the domination of vast territories. The Institut de Droit International was to be an active promoter of international law, and indeed Monnier and the Institute itself wrote to several or all relevant colonial powers with these ideas of how to install a regime and a International Congo Commission around the Congo. So to sum up, inter-imperial and imperial local rivalries were one of the main threats against international stability. Instead of neutralizing or internationalizing the Congo Basin, Monnier suggested to establish an international river commission with sufficient powers to protect the principle of freedom of navigation. And this principle guaranteed continuous access to the navigable international river for everyone under the principle of complete equal treatment. And in this sense, the legal experts suggested indeed to purchase liberty, namely the liberty of navigation, with trans-imperial rivalry, as liberty was in the general interest. How, general interest in Monnier's and contemporaries' view, how the interest of expanding commerce, missions, and science to realize this so-called progress was also at the expense of the local population needs to be researched. But taking position against the individual interest of France and mainly Portugal, this was also an important statement by the International Institute. One can conclude that these legal experts did not limit their input to apolitical standpoints. All these legal ideas and principles are discussed by a wider collection of international legal experts these years, such as the Swiss Monnier, like I just talked about, the Belgian Lavalleje, but also the Dutch Thomas Asser, the British Travers Twiss, and the French Engelhardt, and they would shape the bandwidth of the discussions in Berlin later that year. Many of these experts were in fact present during the conference, and 2 of the 3 points at the agenda were indeed establishing freedom of commerce in the Congo Basin and implementing freedom of navigation on the Congo and the Niger rivers. There was no talk, or at least not as a point to discuss, for neutralizing the Congo Basin. But the scope and scale of powers that, for example, the International Congo Commission would be charged with was, of course, still very much a matter of political debate, and this is where I would like to take my research further. Thank you.
Thank you, Joep, for your insightful talk. I equally enjoyed your presentation as well. And it's now time to move on to the last speaker of the panel. But before that, I'd like to remind our participants one last time that you can send your questions to me via direct chat. I'll read the questions to our speakers after the presentation of our third speaker, Erik de Lange, who I'd like to introduce with great pleasure now. Erik is another colleague of mine from Utrecht University and Security History Network. After having worked as a PhD candidate within the ERC-funded research project Securing Europe, Fighting Its Enemies, Erik is now conducting research on naval cooperation and the international ordering of the Mediterranean Sea in the 19th century. He's currently based at King's College in London as a visiting researcher. Combining naval, diplomatic and cultural history, part of the archival work for Erik's research has received funding from the Humboldt-Yale History Network. Erik defended his dissertation, Menacing Tides, Security, Piracy and Empire in the 19th Century Mediterranean in February 2020 at Utrecht University, just before the pandemic. His monograph that comes from his thesis is currently under review by Cambridge University Press. My fingers are crossed for you, Erik. And besides the history of the Mediterranean in general, Erik's research interest includes violence and law, maritime security, 19th century imperialism, practices of diplomacy, and the history of knowledge. So Erik's presentation is titled An Army of Many, the 1830 Invasion of Algiers as a Multinational Endeavor. Erik, if ready, you can take the floor now.
Great. Thank you, Ozan. Thank you for those kind words and for those crossed fingers on the manuscript, on the review. Let's hope for the best. I also want to thank everyone in attendance for bearing with me on this last presentation of the final panel as we gradually move towards the shining ending of our conference, the keynote by Agaliz Sauer-Costas that will follow after I finish talking and after our panel ends. I also want to thank my fellow panelists for kind of setting the stage perfectly for my paper, because I too will be discussing Africa, North Africa to be precise, and I will also be focusing on France, although just before Louis-Philippe came to power in 1830, the July Revolution, of course, famously coincided with the French invasion of Algiers that I'll be talking about right now. Okay, so French military expeditions during the Age of Revolutions were crowded affairs. That is no secret. When Napoleon Bonaparte went to Egypt in 1798, he brought along many of the French Republic's best and brightest, including savants in the arts and sciences. Something similar happened during that other great trans-Mediterranean campaign of the era, namely the 1830 invasion of Algiers. Counting 37,000 soldiers, 4,000 horses, 600 mules, and about 1,000 heads of livestock, the so-called Armée d'Afrique also brought along scientists, painters, and writers. What is less known is that this army also depended to a great deal on foreign manpower, material aid, and diplomatic support. The omission of that foreign involvement in the historiography is not unsurprising, I would say. Historical narratives of the invasion as a unilateral national affair undertaken against European opposition have a very long tradition, actually. We can see it already in this quote from the invasion's official chronicler, Jean Toussaint Merle, who wrote, "The expedition to Africa was undertaken in spite of Europe. It succeeded in spite of the Liberal Party, but within 20 days, the piracy that had desolated Christianity for 3 centuries was destroyed. Algiers the warlike succumbed under the arms of France." But this was not the full story. As Merle himself had to admit, an immense majority in France saw the invasion with pride, and the whole of Europe saw it with envy. From all sides, people tried to take part in it. So this kind of raises the question, if the legitimizing narratives of the invasion were really so much about delivering Europe from the old threat of piracy that the North African corsairs and the privateers from Algiers posed to European shipping, then how national was the invasion really? And if we take this quote into account and look at the offer of support and involvement from foreigners, then we can also ask the question, how French was the invasion of 1830 really? What role did foreign actors play in this event is what I want to find out today in this presentation. I will show that the invasion was a multinational, even inter-imperial affair involving individuals and states from around the Mediterranean and beyond. Thus, I want to argue that the invasion kind of resembles the era's concerted politics of high-level diplomacy, albeit in this case on a lower level of military, commercial, and consular activity that historians have touched upon a bit less frequently, even in the vast history of the Congress system. So my argument about the multinational aspects of the 1830 invasion complements recent work on this topic, informed by the insights of new imperial history. And I'm thinking here in particular of the work of David Todd, Julia Clancy Smith, James McDougall, William Goulois, and the scholars assembled in the edited volume that you can see in the bottom right here, which appeared under the editorship of Abderrahmane Bouchen. My contribution is based on French, British, and Austrian archives, as well as on the so-called grey literature of military actors who joined the army to fight in Algiers. In three thematic pieces, I will show that border crossing involvement was crucial to, first of all, the logistics of the invasion, secondly, to its planning and peopling, and thirdly, to the crossing of the Mediterranean itself. So to start with the logistics. The expedition of 1830 departed from Toulon, a port in the south of France, in late May 1830, after months of preparations and troop movements. In the eyes of some military men, the port itself hardly felt like France anymore. One officer of the general staff, Auguste Barchou de Penhoen, was dazzled by the diversity of nationalities he met in Toulon. He saw seamen from Catalonia, Italy, Malta, Greece, even some men that he describes as barbaresques, which suggests that they come from North Africa. And each of these communities brought with them their own languages and costumes, creating what this particular onlooker called an incredible confusion. So why were these foreign sailors in Toulon? What was their role in the coming expedition? These men were not enrolled in the military or navy, and they also did not actively serve in the war. What they did is that they took along 17,000 tons of provisions for the army, and that they helped transport troops, material, and animals to North Africa. An English consul who was based in Marseille, where some of the ships were summoned before they went to Toulon to receive their provisions. This English consul, he counted 354 merchant vessels in total, and estimated that about 2/3 of those came from abroad. He noted that there were 160 Neapolitans, 78 Sardinians, 16 Austrians, and these would come from the Dalmatian and Adriatic ports such as Venice, Trieste, and Ragusa. He also counted 8 Tuscans, 4 Spaniards, 2 Swedes, 2 Romans, 2 Russians, and a single Greek. The French government hired these foreign shippers for budgetary reasons, because the freight rates were actually lower abroad. For instance, in Naples, a ship could be chartered at 13 francs per ton, which was much lower than the French rate of 16 francs at the time. And so the Armada Afrique came to depend upon a ragtag transnational fleet for its logistics, even though, and this is important to note, all the ships were ordered to fly the French flag during their crossing of the Mediterranean. But these foreigners also brought particular skills and technologies that would prove essential to the campaign. The French, for instance, used a typically Catalan ship design with a shallow hull that was originally used in fishing and cattle transport to ease the disembarking of French troops on the shores of Africa. Bateaux boeufs, rid of them. You can see a picture here. As you can see, these ships are quite shallow. They would sail in tandem in their fishing as you can see in the bottom right picture. Here's another picture where you can see them in full action during the disembarking of the troops. They were quite handy in moving soldiers from these big ships of war to shore. Another example of this had to do with English technology. Because the coasts of Algiers were known to be dangerous and treacherous, French naval commanders also wanted to use a set of steel cables to help in the landing of the troops. These cables were specifically designed for the purpose by a firm from the United Kingdom and could apparently only be acquired there. Although the British cabinet banned ship owners from joining the expedition, it was unable to stop this particular transaction. So both of these examples indicate how important foreign know-how and techniques were to the 1830 campaign. In addition, cables and the bateau boeufs would also play a surprising role once the expedition got underway, as I will be telling you later. So amassing all the goods, animals, and ships was one thing, but getting them across the Mediterranean in a successful military campaign was quite another. Much depended on the planning of the expedition, and French officials certainly spent many hours engaged in expert debate on geography, timing, and institutional support. From the outset, they also included other countries in their plans. Spain, for instance, was particularly important, owing both to its location and to the recent French intervention in support of the monarchy there, which took place in 1823. The general Louis Auguste Beaumont, who was the Minister of War and would later become the Commander-in-Chief of the Armée d'Afrique, he wanted access to Spanish ports. He planned to rally the expeditionary fleet at Mallorca, which was located exactly at the halfway point between Toulon and Algiers. And he also wanted to construct a military hospital at Mahon on nearby Menorca. Well aware of his indebtedness to France, the Spanish King Ferdinand VII was nevertheless hesitant to provide support. He feared reprisals from Algiers in case things went awry, which already shows you that the divisions of power weren't entirely clear yet. It wasn't a clear-cut victory for the French in the eyes of contemporaries. King Ferdinand demanded a special defensive alliance from France in return for his support. The French government was unwilling to grant this, but nevertheless managed to pressure him into compliance. Paris argued that France acted in a very selfless way, without any demand for compensation for a cause that all of Europe, as it claimed, eagerly supported. So Europe again features very prominently in the diplomatic legitimation of the French invasion. The French pulled a similar feat in the court of Sardinia in Italy, which was also not very enthusiastic about opening its port facilities to the French campaign. The French ambassador in Turin then reminded the Sardinians that the Algerines were a group of pirates, and I quote here, situated beyond the communal law of nations. Eventually, the Sardinians too gave in. So here we can see how the French used the idea of the invasion as a European affair to overcome diplomatic opposition and secure access to ports, markets, and territories that they deemed essential to the campaign. What is interesting is that the French government also sought diplomatic support beyond Europe, most notably in the Ottoman Regency of Tunis. Hussein Bey, the regent of Tunis, had actually turned Tunis into a fortified camp ahead of the invasion, as one French source states. He feared that Tunis was going to be invaded too, which indeed would have happened in an earlier discarded version of the invasion plans, where Mehmet Ali would support the French and move westward across North Africa, occupying all of the so-called Barbary Coast to help France in its war with Algiers. So although that plan was off the table, Hussein Bey was still eager to ward off any danger to his regency, and he therefore offered extensive guarantees of neutrality to the French, also after a fair share of intimidating diplomacy, even with gunboats involved. He then allowed the French to take on provisions in Tunis, and he even sent one of his closest advisors to witness the invasion on board a French ship of war. Other forms of international support for the French were unsolicited and sometimes came as an unpleasant surprise. Tourists from all over Europe flocked to Marseille and Toulon to watch the preparations of the embarkation and to catch a glimpse of the Dauphin who inspected the troops before they left. A fair share of adventure seekers and oddballs was amongst these tourists as well. One of my favorite individuals was an Italian hustler who tried to make a fortune selling a special concoction, an anti-hemorrhaging liquid that you could rub on a wound to stop bleeding, which he, and this is less nice about the guy, was actually demonstrating brutally on the stray dogs of Marseille. However, a more serious concern to the French authorities were the many foreign volunteers who wanted to serve in the army. Across Europe, a veritable enlistment craze grabbed veterans and uncommissioners on half pay. In this time of peace, they had sometimes very little opportunities to obtain a decent income and actually execute their military profession. So the French government nevertheless banned their involvement. It thought that a loose band of curious spectators would in the end be nothing but a nuisance to the expedition. Paris nevertheless saw itself forced to make a handful of exceptions for the highest ranks of the European nobility. The Austrian prince, Friedrich Karl zu Schwarzenberg, whose father was famous because of his role in the Völkerschlacht, was allowed to join as an amateur, for instance. We can see him on the left here. He would later write several books about the campaign to recount his involvement in 1830. Another exception was the Russian colonel Alexei Filosofov, who we see to the right here. He had served in various campaigns against Ottoman and Persian forces, and he was allowed to bring along his military expertise and act as an observer to the French invasion. Paris actually didn't find his military intelligence particularly enlightening, but that's a different story. Finally, and this is a more elusive figure, there was a Royal Navy officer from England named George Munsell who managed to sneak along with a letter of introduction to General Bourmont and who also joined the French expedition. Allegedly, he was even involved in some combat on the ground as well. What I could find out about him was that he made himself very popular with the men on board the ships when he told tales of his own experience fighting the Algerines. He was an officer during the Anglo-Dutch bombardment of 1816 and had many stories to share about that. So although this would seem minor or perhaps even trivial, I would like to argue that the presence of these men in fact tied the 1813 expedition to the recent history of European anti-piracy efforts, as we can see in the case of this Royal Navy officer, which is also an argument that the French would use themselves diplomatically, for instance, in their dealings with the Ottoman Empire. They would keep stressing that they were finishing a European project of destroying piracy in the Mediterranean and ensuring security at sea for everyone. Moreover, the presence of these foreign volunteers also linked the invasion to future imperial warfare beyond the European continent, as these individuals took their impressions and analyses of 1830 to other theaters of conquest. So now on to the crossing itself. There were several moments when international connections and foreign actors had a direct impact on the shape and progress of the campaign, and I will now discuss three of them. The first took place in Toulon. Although the embarkation of the army was swift and orderly, with a seashore full of tourists watching the proceedings, it actually took curiously long before the French ships raised their anchors and left port. Everyone was on board by 20 May after a week of loading, hoisting, and ferrying, but the fleet, curiously enough, did not move. 5 days passed without any activity, and rumors started to swell. People claimed that the Dey of Algiers wanted peace now, that London was mediating in the conflict, or even that the Royal Navy was planning to intercept the French fleet at sea. 2 British Navy cutters that happened to be in port further raised suspicions of espionage and a possible naval clash with the English. Even the mayor of Toulon started to believe that all the troops might actually be disembarked again and that the whole invasion would be called off. In the end, it turned out that the lead admiral, Guy Victor Duperré, who we see pictured here, was simply awaiting the delivery of these steel cables from England that I was talking about before, which again goes to show how crucial he thought these products to be for the landing. The cables arrived on the 23rd of May, then the wind turned favorably again 2 days later, and the fleet left port. But After only 1 day of sailing on the high seas, the French fleet had another border crossing encounter. It spotted an Ottoman ship of war, accompanied by a French frigate. The Ottoman vessel carried Tahir Pasha, the High Admiral of the Ottoman Empire and a veteran of the Battle of Navarino. Sultan Mahmud II, who we see here, had sent him on the last-ditch effort to mediate between the French and Algiers, but the mission was sabotaged. In Tunis, Tahir was not allowed to enter port, and so he could not reach his destination over land. This had everything to do with the Tunisian pledges of neutrality to the French, of course. And then a French blockade kept him from reaching Algiers by the sea and directed him to Toulon, where he would be stuck in quarantine and effectively neutralized, you could say. When Tahir Pasha met the French fleet of war, Admiral Duperrey nevertheless gave him the courtesy of 20 salutes and welcomed him on board with a fanfare and all the officers of the French in grande tenue, as the sources say. Duperrey treated Tahir to coffee and the two spoke for over an hour. The French admiral actually apologized to his Turkish counterpart for the obstructions to his mission. He said the French and the Dey of Algiers might actually get along in the end after a small bit of fighting. According to one report, Tahir Pasha then smiled faintly, said God would take care of everything, and left soon after. If anything, this was a fated meeting. It reminded the French of the Sultan's enduring suzerainty over Algiers, but it also barred the Ottomans from acting in their own territories, which did not bode well for the future, we see. The final transnational encounter of the cross on the Isle of Mallorca, which we can see to the left here. Palma is this beautiful bay located to the southwest of the island. Adverse weather had by then scattered the French fleet. 2 French ships of the blockade had actually crashed ashore. Its crews were taken prisoner by the Algerines. And so Admiral Duperrey decided to regroup in Palma on Mallorca on the 1st of June. Again, rumors were rampant throughout the ranks. Officers thought that the run-in with Tahir Pasha had altered the plans of the invasion. Sailors on board suspected that the fleets of Britain and Russia were nearby to intervene. Morale worsened as the fleet stayed in harbor for over a week without much communication from the main command. To make matters even worse, the fleet of war actually had to maintain a strict quarantine, supposedly because of the contact with Tahir Pasha at sea, while the supporting convoys, so all the other ships, could venture ashore to attend festivities, eat fresh fruit, and mingle with the locals, which the French did in abundance. Although these Spanish-French contacts were relatively brief, they actually laid the basis for the intimate ties that would later develop between the Balearic Islands and the French colonial project in Algeria. Mallorca, and especially Menorca, the smaller island to the right, became major supply centers for the French army after 1830. They also became main communication hubs between France and Algeria. And there was also waves of Spanish migrants that moved from there to the colony. In the end, it again turned out that Duperrey was staying in Palma mainly to wait for something. This time he was waiting for the bateau boeufs that I was telling you about. These had lost track of the rest of the fleet, and they only slowly started to return again in small groups of 5 or 6 vessels. On the 10th of June, the fleet departed again. As the expedition began the last leg of its journey, one member of the general staff grumbled, and I cite him here: "The Algerians will pay for the trouble they have caused us." Although the Algerians, of course, had very little to do with this delay. Okay, so on to my conclusion. These long forgotten transnational aspects of the French invasion have been very important, and they also hold very important historiographical implications, I would like to argue. They further clarify that this 19th century project of empire utilized resources, actor networks, and institutional support way beyond the boundaries of the French nation. The encounters of 1830 hence destabilized the clear-cut entities that traditionally inhabited much of the literature on this topic. Categories as the French or Europe kind of lose their meaning in this more transnational take on the invasion. The support of Tunis, for instance, makes this very clear. In fact, the same applies to the other side of this impactful conflict. There was a lot of hybridity and diversity over there as well. Over in Statueli, which was located just to the west of Algiers, the encampment of the defending forces included Bedouin nomads, Janissaries, Kabyle fighters, and contingents from the Regency's inland regions. Their violent meeting with the multitudes that were coming at them from across the sea would make 1830 the pivotal year that it has become, as we would do well to remember. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Eric, for this really great presentation and all the nice images. What a nice way of ending the presentations today and at the conference. I will now open the floor for questions by our participants. I'm just checking my chat box, but we seem to have no questions so far. No, in fact, there is one question that just came in now. It's by Giuseppe Greco, and his questions are to Eric. His first question is, he would like to ask what happened to the foreign troops after the siege of Algiers in 1830. And he also has a second question. In 1848, the Sicilian revolutionary government, which had just ceded from Naples, wished to employ the French foreign legions based in Algiers in order to repeal a Neapolitan expedition against Sicily. Did you find any information about these negotiations in your archives? So, and there is one question to Joep by Beatrice de Graaf. In fact, that was also my question. Great question, Beatrice. How do you see continuities between Rhine, Danube, and Congo commissions? So what can we learn from the early 19th century experience? And what were the differences with the experience of Africa in 1880s and especially Rhine in 1810s? Like, is there a European, non-European like a difference, a considerable, discernible difference that informed the workings of these commissions? A question to Silvio is currently coming. Yes, it's arrived. Silvio, this is for you. How did the July Revolution alter the collective security system, Congress system, if you like? So maybe we go in reverse order. We start with Silvio, and so that Eric can also rest a little bit. And then we hear from Joep and then from Eric again. So Silvio.
Okay, I'm here. So the question is very interesting because we have said that the friends of Louis-Philippe had two principal lines of foreign politics. So the main line is for maintenance of a European equilibrium, obviously. So the security of Europe was the main aim of Louis-Philippe. But I appreciated very much the in-depth analysis of the Algeria in the last intervention because it demonstrates that the European security was related to a strange equilibrium, but also on rivalries between the great powers in Europe. So there is a red line between the years that follow the July Revolution. So we need to study the dynamics, to the European dynamics of the time and the changes that occurred over time in Europe, to learn that the European security was a principal question of rivalries between among the great powers, because we have talked about the France and Great Britain, but there was also the Austria, Prussia, Russia, also the various situation of the Italian states. We have the case of the Sicily of the Neapolitan kingdom. So I think that the July Revolution changes the European security in the first part of the revolutionary process for the alignment with the United Kingdom. So there was obviously a period of peace, but after Algiers and other missions outside the borders, obviously everything changed. Everything changed in also in Europe with the realignment with the Central Empire. So I think that we have to know that the dynamics are central for this question. I hope that everything is clear.
Yeah, thank you, Silvio. Great answer. Joep.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Beatrice. There are very clear. There's a clear reference also during the Congo Commission, during the Congo Conference, to what happened in 1815 in Vienna. But at the same time, there are also huge differences. If you look at what happened in Vienna, then the proposal, the principle, indeed, freedom of navigation, was explained in a rather limited way, in the sense that it was, of course, it meant freedom for navigation, but to whom, the question would be. So in this case, at the Rhine, it was the freedom of navigation to the riparian states, not to other states, non-riparian states. So in the case of Britain, for example, they were still not allowed to navigate the Rhine. So there are limitations indeed to this freedom, and that are explained differently in 1815 at the Rhine compared to 1856 in the Danube and 1885 on the Congo. And what you see in the Congo, that the understanding of freedom is indeed much, much larger, much more extended, and much more to the benefit of the great imperial powers. So, for example, the Rhine Commission was also composed of only representatives of the riparian states. So it was kind of a riparian condominium that protected the freedom of navigation to their specific interests as a condominium. What we see in 1856 on the Danube, but of course Constantine can tell us much more about this, and in 1885, is that the liberty for non-riparians, also known as the colonial powers, is much broader interpreted. For example, on the Congo, the idea indeed was also to include additional canals and even railways as part of the Congo River, because they were considered extensions of the river as such. That was, of course, not at all the idea. Well, railways was out of the question in the 1810s, but the idea of adding canals to the freedom of navigation under the Rhine regime was unthinkable. So in that sense, I would say indeed that the imperial mind was much more elaborated in the 1880s, and also in the 1850s when it regarded the Danube, the maritime Danube, than it was in the 1815s. Yes, thanks.
Thanks, Joep. Eric?
Yeah, those are very interesting questions. Thank you, Giuseppe. They kind of go beyond what I tried to do in my dissertation and book manuscript, but they do touch at the heart of what I want to do with this new contribution, which I hope to turn into an article soon. So in terms of your first question, what happened to the foreign troops after 1830? These particular individuals that I discussed go on to have quite interesting careers. The Schwarzenberg fellow from Austria becomes a kind of military vagabond, and he joins conflicts everywhere in Europe and its environs. He fights in the Civil War in Spain, for instance, and writes many books about that as well. He did fall ill in Algiers, actually, and kind of his health kind of never quite recovered from this, interestingly enough. Filosofov, the Russian colonel, goes on to fight in the Caucasus after the 1830s. And the British Royal Navy captain, he goes back into active service in Britain towards the end of the 1830s, and he joins the blockade and bombardment of Sidon. I forget the port in Syria in 1840. Yes. Okay.
Yes, Sidon, yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Ozan, a real expert on this. So in terms of those three men, that's kind of where they go on. Of course, the number of foreigners who are joining the military in Algiers increases significantly after 1830. The French create the Foreign Legion in 1831, drawing people, a lot of Germans, for instance, to North Africa. This kind of ties in with your second question, which, if I understood correctly, is about the potential involvement of the Foreign Legion in the civil war in Sicily. I did not find any sources about this, so I'm afraid I can't help you much there. I think you probably have more expertise on this than I do. That becomes an important factor whenever there's a revolution in metropolitan France. So in 1830, there's actually talk during the July Revolution within the army of going back to France and staging a counter-revolution, bringing the old king back on the throne, saving the ultra-royalist government. That never happens. In 1848, there are French troops that go back to Paris. And according to some historians, this is part of the explanation of why the suppression of the revolution in the streets of Paris was so particularly violent and bloody. So that doesn't really answer it, but that's a nice.
Right, thank you, Eric. You're frozen at the moment, at least to me. I don't know if it's the case for other people as well. Eric, can you say something? Are you there?
Sorry, yeah, my connection is unstable, it says now.
Yeah, the last part we couldn't hear, but we have two more questions. Maybe let's move on to those. And both of these questions are for you, Eric.
Okay.
So the first one is by Ivan Ordonez, and he's asking, besides the nationalities of the expeditionary force, was the invasion of Algiers in 1830 financially funded by their countries, or was it completely funded by France? And the other question is by Ruud Kaspari, who is asking, wasn't there a Royal Navy squadron in the Mediterranean? If so, did they keep distance on purpose? He asks. If we have 8 minutes, maybe I'm going to ask my question to Sylvia in the meanwhile as well, because we have no other questions. Sylvia, could you tell us maybe a bit more about how the Anglo-French Entente was broken in 1840? Did Louis-Philippe see it coming during the Eastern Question when Adolphe Thiers was explicitly suggesting that the cause of Egypt is the cause of France? I mean, it was becoming more and more obvious that the Anglo-French relations were deteriorating rapidly, and Louis-Philippe kind of fanned the tensions with his statements, like it was threatening main Austria and Prussia, arguing that I'm going to release the tiger of revolution. They shouldn't really play with me. They shouldn't exclude France in the intervention process. So could he not see that the two countries would come to the brink of war? And then how did they mend the relations after 1841? Like, until how did the process of like this rapprochement take place in the 1840s or 50s leading up to the Crimean War? Yep, so we don't have any other questions. I asked you my question, which was also Beatrice's question. So maybe we start with Sylvia again, and then Eric, we finish with you, if that's fine.
Okay, thank you for your very good question, because I think that it's obviously an opportunity for France to join England for the for economic, I think, there was an economic aim at the basis of the relations between England, between Great Britain and France. And mission in when the mission in Algiers obviously took over the Entente Cordiale, was for the same reasons. There is an economic basis that it's not enough an opportunity for the France of Louis Philippe to go on with the British. So there is also another phase of the question. Obviously, there is the attitude of the Great Britain. Obviously, it's not only a French attitude to Great Britain, but it's obviously also the Great Britain to France. And there was a part of the English government that was not very happy about the alignment with France, because their interests were the same. So there was a collapse. At one time, there was a collapse of economic interests, I think. That is the central question. It's the central question for in positive and in negative.
Thank you, Silvio. Eric, you have 4 minutes.
Let's hope my connection doesn't fail us again. I was very sorry about that, by the way. So to go right into it, Ivan Ordóñez's question about the financial backing behind this, that's absolutely fascinating. I want to look into that more, because I think it could hold some interesting parallels as well. I did, so I didn't really look into it too much yet, but I did find one source in the archives mentioning a loan from the Rothschild banking house to finance the invasion. That's maybe an interesting clue to follow further. I know Jérôme Greenfeld wrote an article about the funding of French colonialism in Algeria, but that's more focusing on the post-1830 period. I do know that the French got all their provisions through contracts with one specific house that kind of arranged all the buying of the foodstuffs and the material for them. And there's one other aspect that's interesting about the funding of the invasion. I always thought it was kind of propaganda, but it turns out that the treasury of the day, the treasury of the Regency of Algiers, which the French looted, actually covered all the costs of the invasion. This was kind of a ultra-royalist propaganda argument before the invasion, when they were going to say like, there's no financial risk whatsoever, we'll just take the treasury of the day and everything will be fine. But it turned out that there was actually 50 million francs in that treasury, and the French took all of it. So that kind of doesn't really answer your question. I would definitely be interested in looking more into the financial border crossing aspects of this as well. Then on to Ruud Caspari. Yeah, the Royal Navy certainly was in the Mediterranean. It always kept a quite sizable force there, its permanent squadron in the area. They did not entirely keep their distance, because they were always kind of on the horizon. There were these ships in Toulon. When the French were reaching Mallorca, there was a weird incident with an English ship that crossed the line of battle. It just sailed through without raising or lowering its flag, which upset all the French. The real panic broke out. So the English were making their presence felt, but they were also not interested in really going at war with France because of Algiers. They had no interest in this. They were diplomatically very much opposed to the invasion, but at the same time, they kind of bought into the French argument that this was an anti-piracy effort, and they kind of didn't really go against that legitimation of the invasion, as I've showed in an article that I recently published. So you can read more there. And now it's time, I think.
Excellent. Thank you, Eric, for keeping the time. I'd like to thank all our speakers, especially to Joep, who gave a presentation while he was wrestling with a nasty flu, as I heard earlier today. So get well soon, Joep. And thank you so much, Silvio, Eric, and again, you for your presentations. I learned a lot. Many thanks to our participants for their interest and questions. I think it's time to have a break now before we move on to the last keynote speech of the conference by Agalis Zarakostas. It will start at 8:45. So until then, thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Hello, Agnes. Good afternoon or evening.
Good afternoon. Good evening.
Where are you now? Are you in Greece?
I am in Greece. Yeah, it's 9:45 here.
Oh, 9:45. That's really late. So sorry.
No,
No, it's okay.
yeah, it's great. It's really interesting, the whole organization and the conference.
Thank you. Yeah, it's bringing together quite some fields and subdisciplines and themes in this post-1815 period, and I'm really very happy how it all ties together.
Yeah.
So you're now at the University of Ioannina?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Are there still festivities going on for the bicentennial celebrations of Greek independence?
A little bit.
Yeah, a little bit.
Now it's more like the 1922. It's the Minor Asia catastrophe. So it's about refugees. It's not about the 1821 anymore.
No.
But it's ongoing.
I was in Thessaloniki in October, and nearby in a harbor city, I saw a very gripping statue of a woman with a little child mourning the expulsion.
Okay.
Looking out over the sea to the east where they came from.
When was that?
I think it was in Thessaloniki, a little town, and the statue was quite new, and I think it was also to commemorate 1922. Can that be?
Yeah, maybe. I'm not sure.
The expulsions that took place of Greek people after the First World War.
Yeah, it was right after First World War, and with the Minor Asia campaign and.
Yeah, exactly. Good. I think it's now 9:15, and that means that we are now on for the final session of this 3-day conference, and we are very proud and very happy that we have with us Evangelos Zarakostas, or Egelis, as we may call him. And I also underline the importance that it is a conference on Europe, but not just Central Europe, not just Western Europe, but also Russia, Greece, even stretching towards the Americas, so that we really tried to make it a conference on Europe and beyond. And that's why we're very happy with Egelis here tonight. Egelis completed his PhD thesis at the University of Bristol, and he's now based at the University of Ioannina in Greece. And his thesis was on the topic From Observatory to Dominion, Geopolitics, Colonial Knowledge, and the Origins of the British Protectorate of the Ionian Islands, 1797 to 1822. An extended version of which is going to be published by Routledge as a monograph. He also wrote about medical knowledge and quarantine reform in the British Empire, Corfu. He's interested in social history, the history of the Ionian Islands, the history of the British Empire, and the management of information at that time. And I'm also very happy to share with you a kind of a little revelation that with Egelis, Christos Aliprantis, who spoke earlier today, Ozan Ozavci, and Eric de Lange, we're currently in the process of publishing a special issue on the Greek question 200 years ago in International Perspective for the Journal of Modern European History, which will be published later this year. So this is all a lot of information, and it's leading on to Egelis, your presentation for tonight. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Beatrice, and thanks for the kind words and all the details that you had to remember. I would like to thank the Security History Network for organizing this amazing conference. I would like to thank personally Professor de Graaf and Professor Mickenbridge, who is not here now, but for the immense honor to invite me as a keynote speaker on such a fascinating topic. I learned a lot from all these refreshing papers during the last couple of days, and I've surely taken too much homework to do on a topic often considered old and saturated. As you can see in the first slide, I intend to use a particular case of the Ionian Islands and especially the British Protectorate of the Ionian Islands, in order to illuminate broader questions about European diplomacy and great power cooperation in the period after Napoleon, and particularly in the period immediately after 1815 and before the Greek Revolution. In the picture, you see the passage from the mainland of Greece to the Ionian Islands. So from you can see the island of Kalamos on the left, and you can see how small is the distance and how closely connected was the history of the islands with the mainland, with the Greek mainland. But when I say particular, and when I use the Ionian Islands as a particular case, I do not mean the exceptional. Greek historiography has seen its fair share of exceptionalism for decades, perpetuated by an enduring narrative of national awakening, which led to the founding moment of the modern Greek state. Luckily for most of us, this particular issue of exceptionalism has been addressed more than enough last year in new publications, workshops, and conferences that took place during the celebrations of the bicentenary of the Greek Revolution of 1821. There has been more room now for debating political experimentation, social and political vocabularies of the revolution, gender perspectives and the history of women, Ottoman perspectives of the revolution, but unfortunately, most of these works have not yet been translated from Greek. Soon, we hope there will be. Furthermore, there have been more systematic efforts compared to previous years to incorporate the Greek Revolution into the global age of revolutions, like Mark Mazauer's The Greek Revolution of 1821 and The Making of Modern Europe, or Paschalis Kytromelidis' edited volume, The Greek Revolution and the Age of Revolutions, to mention only a few. At the same time, the coming of a new generation of historians have been keen on integrating the Greek case as well as Greek historiography into their works. From the ones present in the conference, I would recommend reading Eric Delange's forthcoming book on piracy and security culture, or Ozan Ozavtsy's recent book on Western interventionism in the Levant. And no, I do not expect any discounts in book publications from the History Network, the Security History Network. As for my work, I cannot stress enough the importance of linking the Ionian case with global and imperial history, as well as with the history of international relations. After all, historians of British rule in the islands have been warning us about the pitfalls of exceptionalism for a while now. And I'm thinking of works like Thomas Gallant's Experiencing Dominion or Sakis Gekas' Xenocracy. To go to the matter at hand then, the Ionian Islands and their role in great power cooperation. The main argument of this paper is that the Ionian case can be used as prism to look at the emergence of a collective culture in the realm of international relations and security culture as a self-regulating, organizing principle of policing revolutionary activity in the new protectorate. Equally important, the case of the islands allow us to analyze the limits of such cooperation. In the picture we see is actually a late mid-19th century caricature, and it's the modern Greek state, but we can use also the Ionian Islands for the same picture. Before I tackle these issues, I feel a brief historical background until the creation of the protectorate is needed. The islands proved out to be an incredibly complex issue, and this explained why the issue was dragged after lengthy negotiations in Vienna and Paris. Ultimately, the islands passed under British protection as the United States of the Ionian Islands with the Treaty of Paris, the 5th of November 1815, in a post-Waterloo euphoria. Perhaps simply narrating the history of changing rulers constantly for 18 years, as this slide is showing, should be enough of an explanation as to the social, political, and economic turmoil the islanders went through. Over the course of the Napoleonic Wars, the islands passed under the Venetians, the French, a short-lived accord between the Russians and the Ottomans, the French again, and finally the British. When looking at the British perspective in terms of the issue of the islands at the Vienna Congress, Castlereagh was faced with a dilemma. On the one hand, there were strong strategic and economic reasons to keep the islands, since the islands were already conquered by British troops. On the other hand, his main priority was to ensure peace in Europe without clashing heads with Russia over the negotiating table and without creating any preconditions whatsoever for a military escalation in Europe in the future. But then he didn't want to give too much to Russia by allowing her an exit to the Mediterranean, or even worse, by conceding maritime rights, just like he negotiated hard about the Cape, Santa Helena, or Mauritius. There was also an undeniable reality on the ground. Ionians were consisted mostly of a Greek Orthodox population with strong cultural, religious, political, and economic ties to Russia. After all, between 1798 and 1807, the islands had been a Russian protectorate, which was given a constitution and was organized as a federation. In fact, many constitutions. The Septinsular Republic, or Eptanissos Politia, as it's known in Greek, was the first Greek independent state, albeit under Russian protection, and became a powerful point of reference and inspiration across the Greek-speaking world. With regards to the Russian perspective, Alexander was willing to leave the Ionian Islands to the British. Ioannis Kapodistrias, who became a de facto spokesperson for the Tsar for all things related to Greece in the negotiations, was also one of his closest advisors. In fact, using his place as one of his advisors, he became very active in establishing close ties with the Greek diaspora in Russia. There is, for example, a sad reference due to recent events with regard to cities with strong Greek communities in Odessa or Mariupol, where Kapodistrias played an important role in the establishment of Greek schools and churches. Originally coming from the island of Corfu, before I continue, I just need to say that there have been, most of the works that have been written on Kapodistrias, they focus on the period after or during the Greek Revolution and after that, where he became the first Greek prime minister. So I think it's important to, and that's what I'm going to do today, is to say a couple of things about Kapodistrias before the Greek Revolution. Originally coming from the island of Corfu and being emotionally involved with Greece, Kapodistrias was Alexander's best choice to negotiate about the fate of the islands with the better terms for Russia as much as possible. Backed up by the latter, the Corfiot pushed the British to secure Union independence and was asked by Castlereagh, as an individual knowledgeable of Greek affairs, to submit a memorandum which would inform the British delegates about the political situation of the islands. Kapodistrias' main aim was for the British to maintain the constitutional status of the islands, as was established during the period of the Septinsular Republic. Without doubt, when considering the creation of the Ionian Protectorate under the particular circumstances of the counter-revolutionary fervor in European diplomacy, the British commitment to safeguard Ionian independence and constitutional rights was no small achievement. There have been many works on historiography about Kapodistrias, and possibly hundreds in Greek historiography. However, reading through these works and going back to what I said before about Greek exceptionalism, one gets the impression that Kapodistrias was almost acting by himself during the Congress of Vienna and Paris, and that the Tsar was lying somewhere on a comfortable bed, snoring. Of course, this was not true. There have been very few works in Greek historiography, at least, that have drawn on the Russian archives and have examined Kapodistrias' role in the broader context of Russian policy in the Balkans and the Mediterranean, notably the works by the Russian Grigory Ars. Considering the Tsar's policy in the Balkans, Kapodistrias mentioned in his correspondence his previous efforts to convince Alexander that he should adopt a more diplomatically aggressive policy toward the Ottoman Empire, obviously having Greek affairs in mind. Suggesting to abandon Russian commitments towards the Ottomans in terms of the Treaty of Bucharest in 1812, he advised the Tsar to sign a new treaty with the Porte, which would allow the principalities of Serbia, Moldavia, and Wallachia integral autonomy, under Ottoman suzerainty, but with German rulers. A move which Kapodistrias believed would support the political reforms already underway in European Turkey by preventing revolutions to break out. Moreover, the support from the Tsar would significantly consolidate Russian influence in the region. With the fear that this would jeopardize Ottoman-Russian relations further and could threaten the fragile peace in Europe, with the new war between the two countries, Alexander quickly refused. To return to the Ionian Islands, British and Russian delegates came to an agreement, but what Castlereagh mentioned in the slide I showed you before, as the pretext, as the pretext for the renewal of Russian protection was not simply mentioned in a vacuum. It came as a result of allegations made by Ionians forwarded by Kapodistrias and Count Leven to the British government of public hangings and a system of terror that the provisional British commissioner had imposed on the islands by the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Castlereagh sent a strict warning to the commissioner, his name was James Campbell, who soon got replaced by Thomas Maitland. Diplomatically, and at this point this is mostly speculation, Alexander had every reason to push for independent states. A protectorate under international law could afford to Russian foreign policy more room for diplomatic maneuvering than a crown colony like Malta. In the context of the post-Napoleonic settlement, this option was more diplomatically viable and more suited to Alexander I in particular than a direct Russian challenge to British protection of the islands. But at the same time, in the years after 1815, the case for Russian intervention became stronger amongst British officials, whether due to widespread Russophobia and suspicion over, in quote, Russian influences on the islands or Russian agents, or whether due to the lack of information or because of a combination of both factors. Now, was there any real basis of Castlereagh's warning against the pretext of the renewal of Russian protection with regards to the Ionian Islands? Would Russian officials really make allegations against the British in order to expand Russian influence in the Mediterranean? Did this merely express a more general concern about interstate tensions which would simply wither away in the post-Vienna settlement? These questions remained open to contemporaries, but that does not mean that we should not ask them today. Regardless of cultural stereotyping or any British suspicions over Russian motives, the main modus operandi came from a shared sense of collective security in order to deal with such differences at the higher level of Russian and British diplomacy. This pretext for external intervention could come in the form of accusations against the British violating the Treaty of Paris. Normally, when dealing with a period from the creation of the Protectorate to the Greek Revolution of 1821, most historians of the Ionian Islands are preoccupied with the endeavors of the Colonial Office and the British Governor of the islands in order to get Ionians, in quote, to slide into a constitution, as the Colonial Secretary, Earl of Bathurst, framed it. The Constitution of 1817 was based on the Treaty of Paris and was the foundational text of the Anglo-Ionian state. But in reality, the Constitution was simply a facade of British power, allowing for the British High Commissioner Thomas Maitland to seize all powers, and that he did. The Constitution of 1817 and Maitland's abuses of power are mostly debated in Ionian historiography as the shady proceedings of yet another imperial power which masked military and economic force as international law. Most historical works then go about detailing the manifestations of imperial rule. And this is certainly a part of the story, but I think that the political status of the islands depended much more on a sense of collective security than on an abstract constitutional canon, and was much more integrated to international relations than of what has been often assumed. Here we see Maitland on the left. It's a more pleasurable picture than on the right. As you can see, I just want to show the controversy surrounding Maitland. The right depiction is not exactly complimenting him. Maitland was abolishing Ionian political bodies and was sending his political opponents in exile at whim. Individuals to his liking were took office with extraordinary salaries, and in general, Maitland's conduct had rightfully made a governor a target of intense criticism in the British Parliament, notably by an alliance of liberal Whigs and radical MPs led by Joseph Hume, especially on issues when expenditure or costs, colonial costs, were involved. This debate started in June 1821, but earlier than that, Kapodistrias had gathered complaints about Maitland's many abuses of power from his countrymen and countrywomen against the High Commissioner. He thus compiled a detailed memorandum, personally attacking Maitland's authoritarian governance, which he submitted in person along with Count Leven to Bathurst in London in July 1818. Now, I want to spare you with the details of the personal rivalry between Maitland and Kapodistrias. Some colleagues and friends like Eric de Lange have sufficiently paid the price of my love for microhistory for all of you, so you can thank him for that. However, one thing that struck me was going through British official correspondence on the one hand and looking at parliamentary proceedings on the other, and that was the complete absence of any mention to Kapodistrias in the proceedings, particularly by members of the opposition who had every reason to criticize Maitland's conduct or to attack the Tory government through Maitland. This struck me as odd, particularly after having gone through a voluminous and most detailed correspondence between Bathurst, Maitland, and other officials stationed on the islands, which outlined every little detail in Kapodistrias' character, and of course monitoring every step that he took when he was in the islands. Joseph Hume himself had lived in the Iron Islands, and so it was impossible that he did not know the famous Corfute. Then how can we explain such deafening silence other than the fact that both Russian and, including Kapodistrias of course, and British officials kept the issue very private and most confidential? Such concentrated efforts of diplomats and politicians to avoid publicity in order to prevent the corrosion of diplomatic relations, and the ways in which European diplomacy was concealed from domestic public opinion, is an aspect of the post-Napoleonic collective security taken seriously into account in works of colleagues also involved in this conference like Beatrice de Graaf or Glenda Sluga. At the same time, however, Kapodistrias had his own connections in the Ionian Islands, more notably Ionian politicians like Dionysios Romas or Anastasios Flambouriaris, the Greek diaspora, and in Britain. In fact, charting these connections, the motivations and ambitions of individuals being involved have been a very fruitful line of inquiry, and one I will be pursuing for a book project I have in progress, as Beatrice mentioned in the beginning. In the end, Alexander would not harm his relations with the British more and reacted very differently, judging his stance a few years before. For example, when he criticized the British government for James Campbell's public hangings and the system of terror that I mentioned before. So he withdrew his support from Kapodistrias, leaving him disappointed and susceptible to criticism. After 2 years of correspondence between him and the British government, and 1 year before the Greek Revolution broke out, Castlereagh and Bathurst were really fed up. They rejected Kapodistrias' accusations against Maitland and against any abuses of the Treaty of Paris. They did not even respond to Kapodistrias' new letters when he wrote to Wellington or Bathurst in June 1820, and the government refused to proceed to apply any of the changes that the Corfute proposed in his memorandum, as this would give more ground for complaints. The result of this failed memorandum was the Greek diplomat to be coined as a liberal by his opponents, or worse. Metternich referred to him as a thorough fool, while Maitland boasted that the Corfute was just another feather in his cap, as he framed it. Kapodistrias and his Greek endeavors became increasingly more isolated from Russian policy, culminating with his resign from Russian service in 1822, after Alexander refused to support the Greek Revolution at the time. I think there is something interesting from this shift of attitudes towards Kapodistrias by officials like Castlereagh, Metternich, or Maitland. This was the fact that collective security was also used as an organizing and exclusionary principle which would build coherence amongst the supporters of the Vienna settlement. Similarly, branding an individual as a revolutionary by any means necessary would help re-establishing and reinforcing the security culture and the belief to absolutist monarchy. The change in tone when referring to Kapodistrias in official and private correspondence amongst British officials is remarkably different during the 2-year period of the memorandum. There were many cases when Maitland, Bathurst, or Frederick Adam, who was the second in command in the Ionian Islands, referred to Kapodistrias as an instigator of revolutionary activity or as the leader in a nebulous network of secret organizations who actively aimed to, in quote, awaken the Russian interest. From the primary sources I have examined, these accusations went beyond the British dependencies and circulated also from Austrian officials like Metternich or Ottoman officials in Paris and Vienna, who most of them were Greeks. I need to say that. In some cases, Maitland and Bathurst actively sought to plant evidence which would prove the supposed revolutionary activity of the Corfiot, particularly after the Greek Revolution broke out. A tactic which was used in different occasions to other Ionian politicians as well, which were enough for them to be exiled to an islet or islets in the Ionian Sea. For example, there's a testimony by Christophoros Perevos, an officer in the Greek army who was exiled from the Ionian Islands because he was accused of acting against the Anglo-Ionian government. He's the guy on the left. During the Greek Revolution, Napier, the British governor of Cephalonia, was ordered by the High Commissioner to find and fetch him. Perevos was pardoned, he was offered money, and he was given the option to return to the islands should he wish, as long as he gave the British a letter or clear evidence that Kapodistrias was the organizing force behind the revolution. Perevos lied and responded that he did not know Kapodistrias and that he therefore did not have any such evidence, whilst he knew him at least since 1798. The irony being here that Perevos, who was eventually left alone by the Greek sympathizer Napier, had been actually a member of a secret society, the Filiki Eteria, or Society of Friends. Before I proceed to the conclusion of my paper, two things need to be mentioned here. First, with regards to Kapodistrias' ideological proclivities, as it has been argued repeatedly elsewhere, Kapodistrias in principle was no revolutionary. He was more concerned with education, reform, and overall a gradual process towards cultural improvement than with revolutions. Secondly, secret societies operating on the islands, like the Filiki Eteria, or Society of Friends, were not as ideologically coherent or as geographically extensive as authorities assumed. In fact, should members of the Society of Friends knew that they were part of a universal conspiracy under a French-inspired directory with Kapodistrias as a leader, first they would be surprised and then they would be amazed. There is the example of Dionysios Romas, one of Kapodistrias' contacts in the islands and an Eterist, a member in the Society of Friends. Romas wrote to Kapodistrias when the latter was in the Treaty of Laibach, in utter surprise and frustration that Maitland was presenting the Ionian opposition as members who, beginning of quote, acted in accord with the radicals, the liberals, the Carbonari. And he continued, beginning of quote, there are no heroes and excited individuals amongst us who should allow themselves to be carried away from the principles of an imaginary state built upon clearly vague foundations. Our ideas are based solely upon our rights, which have been confirmed by the will of great European powers. We merely ask for a country. Despite Kapodistrias' defeat, and despite the withdrawal of Tsar support in 1820, he remained an enigmatic figure for British officials throughout. An individual whose real intentions and the exact nature of connections with Russia, as well as with Greeks, were an object of endless speculation even after he resigned from Russian service. In my paper, I do not want to assess here Kapodistrias' role with secret societies like Filiki Eteria or his role during the Greek Revolution, as this would take an entire book. There seems to be enough evidence which show that the endless British speculations about his connection with the Russian government or the belief that he was in charge of a universal conspiracy had never materialized, although they were enough to ruin his reputation in most European courts. On the other hand, there was more foundation on British suspicions over his extensive network of connections. Odysseus at least had a plan B in his mind when considering how to improve the situation for Ionians by securing their constitutional rights and a greater devolution of power to Ionian political bodies. But we do not know what would have happened should the British government had intervened and replaced Maitland with another, more liberal governor, something that indeed happened with George Nugent in less than 10 years later, right at the moment of Britain's Great Reform Act of 1832. But this is a presentation for another day. To conclude, I think that the underlying assumption of my paper is to argue that it is equally important to analyze this newfound belief in collective security after 1815, as well to emphasize on the limits of the system. I would agree with Beatrice de Graaf's formulation about the security managers, that they fanned with their methods the flame of the desire for freedom, but mainly from within. When considering Capodistриa's memorandum to the British government, for example, the shared notion of what should go public and what should not, and the subsequent unwillingness of the British government to abandon an imperial policy, what should it tell us about the particular characteristics of collective security in the post-Napoleonic era? It seems that in this case, there was a shared sense of not collectively dealing with abuses of the Treaty of Paris, but one which was asymmetrical and self-regulating. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Egelis, for this wonderful expose. Very rich argument that really spanned the whole period from before 1815 till after, from the British till the Russian and the Greek revolutionary perspective on this. So I also think that you made a wonderful summary of everything that has been discovered so far in the recent years on the importance of the Greek Revolution for Europe, for the Congress system, for the collective security system, and of course also for the situation in the Mediterranean itself. I do have a couple of questions for you. People are still glued to the screen after a whole day of Zooming, which is in itself remarkable. Says something about your ability to captivate people. The question is from Eric de Lange, and he asks you, Egelis, could you say something about the relationship between Maitland and the old Venetian aristocracy of the Ionian Islands? Did they like each other on the basis of the conservative ideas? And in line with what Matthijs Lok yesterday expounded, could we see something of a cosmopolitan conservatism at work here? And could that also perhaps explain British Russophobia? It's a long question, but an interesting one, and I hope you can say something about it.
Should I respond now, or should I wait for more questions?
Yes, no, please go ahead. Okay. Yeah.
There was it's a really interesting question, and thank you, Eric. And there was a constant suspicion of Maitland and basically anybody else. So he was referring to an impenetrable wall of intrigue when he was referring to this old Venetian aristocracy, Italian-speaking Greek, but an aristocracy which was very old since the Venetian times. So he tried to create a new aristocracy, so to speak, which would be more loyal to the British crown and would be part of what Bailey mentions as a proconsular despotism, but it never it never materialized. So he tried to create a new aristocracy through knighthood or through special patronage, but it never materialized. And I think one big reason why this never happened was the Greek Revolution. That's the first very simple, straightforward question, but answer. But yeah.
No, yes, I think that's already a very good direction of an answer. There's another question. Egelis, if you look at the Greek Revolution and at the role of Capodistrias, do you think that Capodistrias himself, like the types that Eric, the officials that Eric described, who really argued with the European Congress and the European system and to legitimize their invasion in Algiers. Do you think that for Capodistrians and the Greek revolutionaries, this European Congress system, the collective security system, the post-1815 peace was a true argument, or was it a legitimate, how do you say, a foil for legitimacy? Was it something that they really believed in or that they used? How did they see their own fate within this broader European setting? Did they reckon with it?
Sorry, there were some glitches and I've lost some what you said.
Sorry, I'll put it shorter. The question is, did the Greek revolutionaries and did Capodistrias, did they see themselves as being part of a European system, or did they use it as an argument for legitimacy in trying to convince the European system that they had to support them? So did they really believe in the European cause, or did they just argue with it?
Well, okay, there Capodistrias was kind of in a go-between, and in many ways he was connected with many Greeks of different social classes and different backgrounds, but he was trying to maintain some balance between national, like Ionian interests and his allegiance to the Russian government, at least until 1822. And this makes him a very enigmatic and a very interesting figure to study, because he also never mentions exactly in a fully what he had in mind through his correspondence. So in a way, yes, to answer the question. And there was, yeah, I hope I answered this. I mean, I'm sorry, but I've lost, there are constant glitches and I've lost half of what you said. So
no, sorry. No, it made perfect sense, and you already said something about it in your presentation as well. It's the exciting, the interesting, the fascinating thing about it is how European was the Greek Revolution. Was it about the Greeks themselves, or were they truly and really also trying to be part of this European system? That's something that we also, Agilist, try to do in our special issue, connect the threats of European collective security, post-Napoleonic peace with the Greek question. But I think you answered that satisfactorily. There are no other questions, and I think that's also due to the fact that it's already getting late, and you're very comprehensive and very complete also in your presentation. So I think it's now time to wrap it up. And again, I would like to stress, Agilist, that we're very happy that you had the keynote and the final keynote at the end of this conference, that you really tied all those threads together: Russia, Britain, the revolutionaries, the conservatives, Europe, the smaller countries, great powers. It all comes together more or less in the Greek Revolution. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for inviting me.
Yes, and all those talks will be recorded, so everyone can look them up in a couple of days when we put them up into our security history network site. Please feel free to join us. Some of you are already members, others that are interested can just send us an email. And again, I would also like to thank my co-host, Alexander Mikaberidze. He should be here in a minute. He was here all the time, but he had to step out very briefly. But I'm sure that he would also have been delighted with his talk, Agilist. So on behalf of Alexander Mikaberidze, also on behalf of all the organizers of the Security History Network, Eric de Lange, Ozan Ogzavci, Anne-Lotte Jansen, but most especially, I know she's here, Lena Harding. She was and is ill, but she still is here. She organized everything, sent you all emails. So I would like to put her very briefly. Lena, can you very briefly put on your camera, if you like, not too ill, just to thank you on behalf of all of us here.
I'm not sure you want to see me in my COVID state.
No, but it's nice to hear you. So thank you very much, Lena, for everything you did.
Not a problem.
And thank you
Thanks a
to
lot.
and thank you to all the others as well, all the participants of today, of yesterday, all the people that presented, Eric, Ozan, Silvio, everyone. And I wish you a very good night and evening. Hope to see you soon for real. Thank you and bye.
Bye.
So, Agnes, we're going to close down in a couple of minutes, but perhaps you would like to hang on a little bit, and Lena and others who are interested, just for a very brief after conference sit.
Were there any problems in this? Could you hear me well?
Yes, there were no glitches at all. You were completely audible and could see all the slides, so there was no problem there. Perhaps on your side.
Because I wasn't sure, because it was constantly saying unstable